M16 is one of the most recognizable weapons to come from the Western world. But while this iconic firearm had a troubled start to its history, it has since cemented itself as an essential part of video game arsenals and is widely viewed as a good guy gun in Western pop culture.
Knock, knock.
While it has appeared in hundreds of movies, TV shows, and video games, why does the M16 have such a legendary reputation? And with its plethora of models and long firearm ancestry, what impact has this rifle had on our video games?
We've come here to the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK to learn a little more about the history and pop culture legacy of one of the most iconic weapons in the world, as well as seeing this classic rifle in action.
The M16 and its family of rifles are one of the most iconic series of weapons both throughout history and pop culture.
With estimates between 10 and 20 million rifles produced, with only the Mosin Nagant, the G98 and of course the AK series of rifles exceeding that number, the M16 has become one of the world's most prominent firearms through its lifetime of over half a century.
The history of the AR-15, or as most people will know it, the M16, which is the US military designation, believe it or not, it's from the 1950s. You can kind of see it in the design. It's a sort of almost a futurist-looking bit of kit made of what were then advanced alloys and polymers, very lightweight. But it was the second attempt, essentially. The AR-10 was the first attempt. An AR standing for Armalite Rifle. Eugene Stoner was the designer. Wonderfully light weapon, really quite controllable with the original design of muzzle device on there as well. My impression, at least, is it was just too sci-fi, too lightweight, too toy-like for the US Army of the day. So it didn't make it through trials, and they ended up adopting a sort of warmed over M1 Garand in the form of the M14, which then ended up being the shortest service rifle in the history of the US, with only 7 years frontline service, because the AR-10 came back from the dead as the AR-15.
A huge part of the M16's history and a moment in time that's conjured up in many people's minds when talking about this rifle is of course the Vietnam War. Early confrontations between the AK-type weapons and the M14 indicated that American units would struggle to maintain fire superiority. The M14 was unsuited for the jungle environment of Vietnam due to its length and weight, and its 7.62 by 51mm cartridge made the weapon all but uncontrollable in automatic fire. To meet the military's new needs, the AR-10 was scaled down and adapted to fire the 5.56 by 45mm intermediate cartridge, becoming the AR-15, which, after further modifications, was finally adopted as the M16. But had America found their answer to the Soviet AK?
Many individuals still favoured their original M14 rifle, as the lightweight and plastic construction of the M16 had some referring to the weapon as a toy. It also had a growing reputation of poor reliability, with a survey of 1,585 soldiers reporting that approximately half of them had experienced stoppages while fighting with their M16.
Despite the legacy of the weapon and the rifle it became, the rush to get the M16 into the hands of the forces in Vietnam meant its early history was marked by this poor reputation and a multitude of issues.
The main one was in the type of propellant adopted for the cartridges, which was not what was advised. Add to that tropical conditions, where corrosion is always going to be worse. They cheaped out on the chrome plating for the chamber and the bore of the barrel as well. Official advice was that the rifle was self-cleaning. This was a revolutionary design that did away with the need for a heavy gas piston moving back and forth. Instead, it had a very lightweight tube, and that was self-cleaning. But the dirt has to go somewhere, and it went into the bolt carrier group, and just disaster. You'll see photos and video from Vietnam of soldiers taping cleaning rods to the side of their rifles, because with all that corrosion and the tropical conditions and the bad powder, your rifle would stop and you'd have to stop your fighting, tell the VC to just hang on a moment while you stick a rod down the bore and bang out the stuck case. Absolute nightmare. Guys were killed as a result of it, and so some veterans, even today, will swear blind that this thing is terrible.
To help alleviate the issue of cartridges failing to seat, the Army insisted on adding a forward assist to the weapon, a feature visible throughout almost every first-person shooter, even if in a few cases it's misplaced or misunderstood.
However, the US Air Force, Colt, and Eugene Stoner himself believed this was an unjustified expense, so the design was split into the M16 for the US Air Force and the XM16E1 for the other branches of military.
The XM16E1 would be redesignated as the M16A1 after it received further improvements, such as the A1 birdcage flash suppressor, with future versions of this muzzle device becoming synonymous with the aesthetics and design of the weapon system. The rifle's reputation began to grow into a much more positive one, and in 1969 the M16A1 officially joined the M16 to replace the M14 as the US military's standard service rifles. The rifle was later improved upon and modified to become the M16A2, which also swapped the full auto function for a 3-round burst. Vietnam saw some units, including Special Forces, issued with a shorter carbine version of the M16, the Colt XM177 Car 15 Commando for close quarters battle.
And the 80s would see a return to this idea with the development of the other iconic weapon from the M16 family, the M4 carbine.
It was easier to carry and utilize in tight spaces and close quarters, and was so successful with special operations forces and support troops that it eventually replaced the full-length rifle. While the M4's shorter barrel meant slightly decreased muzzle velocity, which could reduce wounding effect at longer distances, the powers that be considered that to be an acceptable compromise. After over 90 modifications to improve reliability, ergonomics, and modularity, the refined M4, in the form of the more robust and fully automatic capable M4A1, would become the standard service rifle for the US Army. Although in 2022, the XM7 SIG Spear won the Next Generation Squad Weapon program, which aims to replace the M4 carbine.
With consistent improvements to the platform, wide adoption by countries across the globe, as well as dozens of different variants and weapons owing much of their DNA to the AR-15 and M16 rifles, this weapon has cemented itself as one of the most iconic and prolific weapons in history.
With such a vast legacy and reputation from the real world, it's hardly surprising that the M16 has become such a juggernaut within movies, TV, and video games. 1964's 7 Days in May is a political thriller about US military leaders plotting to overthrow the president, and it also marks the earliest appearance of the M16 in a Hollywood film, appearing on cinema screens months before the weapon even got into the hands of soldiers fighting in Vietnam.
From there, the weapon would go on to feature in hundreds of movies and TV shows. Backdrops featuring military conflicts, either fictional or based on reality, would often feature the American soldier as the hero, with their M16 rifle in hand, sharing some of that fame.
From shootouts between cops and criminals to action-packed classics, spy thrillers, and even science fiction and horror, whenever the silver screen needed a rifle, the readily available and recognizable M16 was the obvious choice. Which also means they've shared the spotlight as a part of some of the most iconic action scenes, while in the hands of some of the biggest stars. The lobby shootout in The Matrix, Arnold's rifle with underslung M203 in Predator, Scarface's little friend, and, of course, that iconic gunfight in 1995's Heat, which is a scene so authentic it's actually shown to Marine recruits as an example of how to reload and retreat under fire. On the video game front, one of the earliest depictions of the rifle is in The Punisher, Capcom's 1993 side-scrolling beat-em-up where the M16 was an obvious choice for former Marine Frank Castle.
In contrast to that comic book-inspired appearance, the use of real-world conflicts, either as inspiration or as a setting, is extremely common within our games, and the prominence of the M16 throughout those real-world events has been mirrored in the arsenal of many shooters.
Games like Men of Valor, Viet Cong, Call of Duty Black Ops, Shell Shock, Arma 3, Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, and even more, all offer an opportunity to play through the war from an American perspective. The same is true for more modern conflicts as well, with many games taking inspiration from military events from across the 90s and 2000s. Titles like Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, Battlefield 2, Full Spectrum Warrior, and many more all took players on virtual present-day campaigns armed with an M16 or an M4. The more modern M16s and M4s found within these games allowed players to virtually tap into the real-life utility of weapon customization, accessorization, and the use of optics, an element of video games that was quickly becoming popular. Some of the accessories associated with the M16 had even started to become iconic additions in their own right. Attachments like the ACOG Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sight or the M203 grenade launcher, which are now very familiar accompaniments to the rifle. The M16 was a familiar weapon that was also a canvas for customization, and many players across the years would have seen these accessories in movies and across news reports, and would want to recreate these loadouts and make use of them themselves.
Of course, video game military fiction is but a fraction of the games that the M16 has found itself in. And even though it's common for the rifle to receive a different name or tweaks to its design, there are still so many guns that are iconic and recognizable as an M16.
The Far Cry series taps into the jungle fighting lineage of the weapon with either the M16, M4, or similar AR-15 type weapon available as an option in nearly every game in the franchise. As M16s or AR-15 style weapons are prominent at home as well as abroad, they can also find themselves in the hands of ne'er-do-wells as a tool of chaos and crime throughout the Grand Theft Auto franchise, or in the hands of civilian survivors fighting across a zombie-infested America in Left 4 Dead. And speaking of apocalypses, it's the perfect weapon for the new California Republic of Fallout New New Vegas, appearing in-game as the service rifle. Its aesthetics are a mixture of AR-10 and AR-15, and if as many were made in Fallout as there were in the real world, I'm sure plenty would have survived the bombs dropping and found themselves in the hands of the all-American peacekeeping force of the Mojave.
While we'll talk more about the rifle's life in games, one thing common to the M16's time on screen is that it's almost always seen in the hands of the hero, the winning side, or the saviors of the day.
We talked about the AK-47 being portrayed as a bad guy gun in a previous episode. So if there was ever an antithesis to that weapon in the world of pop culture, we need look no further. Through its appearances in games, TV shows and movies, it's not hard to see why the M16 falls under the trope of good guy gun.
Well, we have a very strong Western cultural narrative of the US as the world's arguable only superpower now. Ultimately, the leading force at the end of both world wars. Obviously, other nations strongly contributed. And so, of course, any weapon that is seen in the hands of those soldiers is going to get these positive connotations, depending where in the world you're from and what experience you've had. Whereas, of course, the classic bad guy was the Soviet Union, and that had this very visually different weapon, even though you could probably swap weapons from NATO to the Soviet bloc and nothing would change really. But they illustrate design philosophies. Simple, cheap, easy and quick to produce in large quantity versus more precise, thinking more about the user experience. The reason why it's so strongly associated with what we in the West would call the good guys is it's just everywhere.
A virtual arsenal without an M16, M4 or similar AR-15 style weapon would almost feel incomplete, but its vast appearances and depictions means that it's left some very specific footprints in gaming.
The feature most associated with the M16 in terms of gameplay is that it's often shown using a 3-round burst. And while absolutely deadly in some games, or frustratingly lackluster in others, this feature is down to the real-world design of the weapon. During the development of the M16A2, the US forces found that inexperienced troops would spray under fire when using a fully automatic weapon, so they integrated a 3-round burst instead, which could provide the optimal accuracy, firepower, and ammunition conservation.
While the original M16, A1 and A3 are capable of fully automatic fire, burst fire was core to the design of the A2 and A4, as well as the original M4 carbine, and in most games, it's these variants that are depicted.
However, they will most often be complemented by games offering a similar fully automatic option. For example, Battlefield 3 accurately portrayed its M16A3 and M4A1 as capable of being fully automatic, while the M16A4 and M4 are burst. Burst fire is one of the ways that the M16 can sit unique among the rest of the firearms in a game. While many players may prefer the thrill of going full auto, a well-placed 3-round burst offers a different playstyle for those that would rather a series of well-placed shots over spray control. The M16 carry handle is iconic to the weapon and its aesthetic, but it's also an element that has had an effect on gameplay as well. Due to the design often obscuring your sight picture, it has been common to see players complain about the M16 iron sights, and as a result, quickly swapping them out or adding an optic at the earliest convenience.
But these are just two elements to name a few that have influenced more esoteric weapon design and gameplay balance in a variety of different titles and genres.
As Call of Duty explored more futuristic settings, they knew how familiar their fanbase was with many of their weapons, and that they'd be able to use design cues and gameplay in their new fictional weapons to connect a player with something similar. Infinite Warfare's NV4 has all the stylings of a near-future M4A1, and the M8A7 from Black Ops had some aesthetics like the carry handle and flash hider that I feel harken back to the M16 of previous games. The M8A7 in particular was certainly a weapon that scratched the itch that Burstfire fans were feeling when that game launched.
But I think you can see some of these recognizable designs and cues in other games and franchises as well, although I am prepared for some of you to disagree with me here.
The M15 Vindicator and M96 Mattock's angular upper design allows for just a hint of familiarity in the bizarre world of Mass Effect, especially with the M15 being another burst-fire weapon. Many of Borderlands 3's DAR rifles feature similar carry handles, optic arrangements, and Picatinny rails, while many of their weapons also have the ability to fire in bursts. Soldier 76's Night Ops or Commando skins turn his pulse rifle into something that is undeniably a future M16, and while useless as a sight, the carry handle of Deep Rock Galactic's Drac 25 definitely looks like an M16 or M4 if I drew it while I was drunk. Even some of the weapons of Warhammer 40k have a few hints of the AR-15, both making a weapon feel aesthetically familiar while also pointing to the utilitarian firearms and stagnant technology of the Imperium of Mankind in the 41st millennium.
Some games will also add more peculiar variants or customization options to allow for either unique gameplay, utility, or varied gunplay while staying within that same recognizable platform.
2019's Modern Warfare lets you chamber your M4 in 9mm, giving you the in-game equivalent of the real Colt 9mm SMG. Rainbow Six Siege features the AR-1550, an AR-15 converted to fire the powerful 50 caliber Beowulf round, and 2022's Modern Warfare 2 lets players use the love child of a P90 and an AR-15 with the FSS Hurricane. While those are obviously not M16s, they still share some of the same DNA, as well as a little of the legacy. Virtual appearances of both the common, standard versions of the weapon as well as the rarer or more peculiar variants and derivatives shows that the M16's lineage and impact is cemented into the minds of players as an iconic, recognisable rifle. Because of that, the M16 in one form or another will always have a spot reserved within the armories of our video games.
We couldn't do a video on the AK-47 without doing one on the M16. Both are iconic weapons not only throughout history, but within our pop culture as well.
The M16 and M4 have made appearances in hundreds of games and movies, and many shooter fans have built an affinity or connection with these weapons. As a fan of both, I believe you can't help appreciate the rifle's history as well as its pop culture legacy. So whether pure polymer and metal in the jungles of Vietnam, twisted into science fiction facsimiles, or decked out with the most modern and tactical accessories, I can't see our screens ever being without the most iconic all-American rifle, the M16.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Loadout. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below what you'd like to see an episode on, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter @IrregularDave.
If you want more video game weaponry content, you can watch our previous series of this show, or check out our weekly series of Firearms Expert Reacts, where I show our friends at the Royal Armouries a selection of video game arms to break down.
Until next time, I've been your host, Dave Jewitt. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.